This is not a rumor whispered in palace corridors. This is an institutional rupture unfolding in real time. According to sources with direct knowledge of high-level negotiations, a private legal confrontation involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle has now escalated into a full-scale corporate and reputational crisis, one that stretches from Montecito to boardrooms in Los Gatos and echoes all the way back to Windsor Castle. What the public believed was a quiet cooling off between the Sussexes and Netflix was allegedly something far more severe. A breakdown so consequential it triggered internal legal reviews, contract audits, and emergency consultations at the highest levels of the streaming giant. And as insiders now suggest, this dispute is no longer just about content. It is about credibility, authority, and whether a royal brand, once considered untouchable, has crossed a line that global institutions cannot ignore. Because once contracts are challenged at this scale, the fallout never stays contained. Sources say the moment of rupture did not come with a press release or a public statement. It came quietly behind closed doors when Netflix executives reportedly concluded that multiple promised projects tied to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had failed to materialize in a form that met contractual benchmarks. What followed, insiders allege, was not a negotiation, but a reckoning. The Sussexes reported a $100 million development agreement, once framed as a landmark partnership between royalty and Silicon Valley power, is now being re-examined clause by clause. Legal teams on both sides are said to be scrutinizing delivery schedules, creative obligations, and performance thresholds that were quietly embedded in the original deal. According to individuals familiar with the process, the issue is not a single failed documentary, but a pattern of underdelivery that Netflix allegedly views as a material breach. What makes this moment explosive is not just the money involved, it is the symbolism. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, once represented institutional continuity, inherited secrets and global influence. Meghan Markle brought cultural relevance and transatlantic appeal. Together, they were positioned as a prestige acquisition, one that would lend Netflix not just content, but legitimacy. Now, that calculation appears to be unraveling. Insiders suggest the dispute has triggered internal alarm bells far beyond the entertainment division. Corporate risk officers are reportedly concerned about precedent. What happens when a high-profile partner with global recognition fails to deliver at scale? What message does that send to shareholders, regulators, and future collaborators? At the same time, royal watchers note the timing could not be worse. With King Charles III navigating a fragile institutional landscape and Prince William increasingly positioned as the guardian of royal discipline, the Sussexes' legal vulnerability is being watched closely inside palace walls. Sources say senior aides are privately worried that this commercial dispute could bleed into constitutional territory, reigniting debates about titles, privileges, and the limits of royal independence. And as legal correspondence allegedly begins to circulate between California and London, one question now dominates every closed-door discussion. If Netflix proceeds, how far is it willing to go? And what evidence is it prepared to put on the record? Because once documents surface, the story no longer belongs to the Sussexes alone. According to sources briefed on the next phase of the dispute, Netflix's response was neither emotional nor impulsive. It was procedural, calculated, institutional. What appeared publicly as silence was, allegedly, the quiet activation of legal mechanisms designed for exactly this kind of high-risk partnership failure. Insiders claim Netflix's legal department initiated a formal contract performance review, a process that effectively freezes goodwill and replaces it with documentation. Delivery schedules were reportedly mapped against internal benchmarks. Development memos were cross-referenced with public announcements. Confidential clauses, never meant to be debated outside arbitration rooms, were allegedly pulled into active consideration. At the center of this escalation is a concept rarely understood by the public but deeply feared in corporate circles: material non-performance. Sources say Netflix's lawyers are examining whether the Sussexes' output failed not creatively, but structurally, whether milestones tied to funding releases, staffing commitments, and platform exclusivity were missed in ways that trigger clawback provisions. If so, the $100 million figure becomes more than a headline, it becomes leverage. What intensifies the pressure is that these contracts, according to insiders, were written with reputational safeguards. Netflix, burned before by high-profile talent disputes, allegedly inserted language allowing the company to act decisively if brand risk outweighed projected returns. And royal branding, once considered an asset immune to scrutiny, may now be treated like any other commercial variable. Meanwhile, sources say advisors close to King Charles III have taken notice. While the monarchy is not legally involved, the institutional optics are impossible to ignore. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex may be private citizens in business, but they remain royal in title. And when royal names appear in potential legal filings, palace officials reportedly worry about collateral damage to the crown's image of discipline and restraint. There is also quiet discussion, insiders suggest, of precedent. The Privy Council has historically advised monarchs on matters where private conduct threatens public institution. While no formal action is alleged to be underway, the mere revival of such conversations signals concern, because this is no longer just a streaming dispute. It is an examination of authority, who holds it, who borrowed it, and who may now be forced to answer for its use. And as Netflix's lawyers reportedly prepare their next move, another question begins to surface behind closed doors. Was this failure accidental, or was something deliberately concealed from the start? Because buried inside contracts are not just obligations, but timelines. Sources familiar with the internal review now suggest the conflict deepened when Netflix allegedly began comparing what was publicly promised with what was privately delivered, or more precisely, what was never delivered at all. According to insiders, the discrepancy was not marginal, it was structural. Development outlines submitted during the early stages of the Sussex deal reportedly painted an ambitious roadmap. Multiple documentary series, long-form narrative projects, and ongoing access-driven content that would leverage Prince Harry's proximity to royal history and Meghan Markle's cultural reach. Yet individuals briefed on the review claim that several of these proposals stalled at concept stage, never progressing into production-ready form. What raised alarm, sources say, were internal communications indicating that Netflix executives believed they were buying continuity, an evolving pipeline, not isolated one-off releases. Instead, the platform allegedly received fragmented material, delayed treatments, and projects that insiders describe as non-scalable. The issue, according to one source, was not quality but dependency, content reliant on access that may no longer exist. And this is where allegations of concealment begin to surface. Insiders now suggest Netflix's legal team is examining whether the Sussexes' proposals were built on assumptions that quietly collapsed after their relationship with the royal institution deteriorated. Access to archives, willing participation from royal-linked figures, institutional cooperation. Sources say Netflix may argue that these elements were implied, if not explicitly guaranteed, during negotiations. If proven, this transforms the dispute. It becomes less about missed deadlines and more about misrepresentation. At the same time, attention has reportedly turned to financial flows. According to sources, accountants are reviewing how development funds were allocated, whether money earmarked for production was diverted into overheads, staffing structures, or external initiatives unrelated to deliverable content. No wrongdoing has been established, insiders caution, but the scrutiny itself marks a turning point. Across the Atlantic, royal aides are said to be watching with growing unease. The prospect of legal filings dissecting the Sussexes' post-royal operations raises uncomfortable questions about how royal identity was leveraged commercially and whether boundaries were crossed. One palace-connected source allegedly summarized the anxiety bluntly. If documents show promises that relied on royal access, the institution will be dragged into a narrative it cannot control. And as Netflix's review allegedly moves from evaluation to enforcement, a new element enters the story: time, because sources now claim a deadline has been quietly set, a moment after which explanations may no longer be enough, and once the clock starts, silence becomes its own kind of evidence. According to sources with knowledge of the ongoing negotiations, the dispute entered its most volatile phase when Netflix allegedly issued what insiders describe as a formal notice of cure, a procedural step that transforms concern into countdown. The notice, sources say, outlines specific deficiencies, measurable benchmarks, and a limited window in which corrective action must be demonstrated. This is not a public ultimatum, it is far more serious. In corporate law, a cure period is the moment when intent hardens. It signals that patience has ended and that the next steps, arbitration, litigation, or settlement enforcement, are no longer hypothetical. Insiders claim the Sussexes were given a finite time frame to show tangible progress on multiple fronts: production timelines, content scope, and proof that proposed projects can realistically move into execution. What intensifies the pressure is that this clock is allegedly running in parallel with Netflix's internal fiscal calendar. Streaming platform sources note, do not wait indefinitely. Accounting cycles demand resolution. Shareholder disclosures require clarity, and unresolved nine-figure liabilities cannot be allowed to drift. At the same time, sources say advisors close to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are scrambling to stabilize the situation. Emergency strategy sessions, accelerated pitches, last-minute development meetings aimed at salvaging momentum before the deadline expires. But insiders caution that speed may now work against them. In this phase, rushed promises carry more risk than reassurance. Across the Atlantic, the implications are reverberating through royal circles. Palace-connected figures reportedly fear that if legal proceedings advance, the timeline could intersect with sensitive institutional moments, state events, succession messaging, and King Charles III's ongoing efforts to project stability. The monarchy thrives on controlled pacing. Legal clocks do not respect tradition. This creates a collision of pressures, corporate urgency versus royal legacy. One source close to the situation allegedly remarked that the deadline is not just about content, it is about credibility. Whether the Sussexes can still command institutional trust when scrutiny replaces goodwill, whether influence can be converted into deliverables under legal supervision. And as the final days of the alleged cure period approach, another tension begins to surface, one that money and contracts alone cannot resolve. Because once deadlines threaten to expose failure, families start asking harder questions about responsibility, about inheritance, and about who carries the cost when legacy becomes liability. And inside the House of Windsor, those questions are beginning to sound uncomfortably familiar. Sources close to royal households now suggest the Netflix deadline has triggered a deeper reckoning, one that has little to do with streaming metrics and everything to do with legacy. Inside Windsor Castle and Sandringham House, conversations are reportedly shifting from sympathy to calculation, from private concern to institutional self-preservation. Prince Harry's position has always been uniquely fragile. As the younger son of King Charles III, his inheritance was never land or title alone, but trust, access granted by proximity, sustained by discretion. Sources say that trust is now under renewed scrutiny, not because of a single deal, but because this dispute threatens to recast royal separation as commercial exploitation. Insiders allege that senior advisors have raised uncomfortable hypotheticals. What happens if arbitration filings reference royal history as a selling point? What if internal documents imply expectations of cooperation from palace-linked entities that were never authorized? The monarchy governed by precedent and restraint cannot be seen as underwriting private commercial risk. Prince William, according to sources, is acutely aware of the implications. As the future king, he is said to view the situation not emotionally but institutionally. Royal authority depends on distance from controversy, and if the Sussexes' business dealings begin to blur that distance, the response may need to be corrective rather than compassionate. There are also whispers, insiders claim, of symbolic boundaries being reconsidered, not formal sanctions, but subtle signals: access reduced, representation narrowed, ceremonial associations quietly reassessed. These are the monarchy's traditional tools: slow, quiet, irreversible. For King Charles III, the dilemma is reportedly personal as well as constitutional. A father watching his son under pressure, a monarch tasked with protecting an institution that cannot bend to individual crisis. Sources suggest the question facing him is not whether to intervene, but how not to, because any overt involvement risks appearing as royal rescue. And in the context of a commercial dispute of this magnitude, rescue becomes endorsement. As the Netflix clock continues to tick, Insiders say the palace is preparing for a scenario in which the Sussexes must navigate the consequences alone. No behind the scenes mediation, no institutional cover, just the cold clarity of contracts and courts. And it is here, at the intersection of family and future, that the story tightens further. Because when legacy becomes vulnerable, strategy replaces sentiment, and somewhere beyond palace walls, countermoves are already being drawn up. Moves designed not to save relationships, but to contain damage. Sources now indicate that as emotional considerations receded, strategy moved to the foreground. Inside royal advisory circles and corporate boardrooms alike, the emphasis reportedly shifted to containment, limiting exposure, narrowing risk, and preparing for outcomes that no longer include reconciliation. On the Sussex side, insiders claim a rapid recalibration is underway. Advisors are allegedly restructuring project portfolios, quietly shelving concepts deemed too dependent on royal proximity, and refocusing pitches around safer non-institutional narratives. The goal, sources say, is to demonstrate independence at scale, proof that future content does not rely on the crown, its archives, or its silence. But this pivot carries its own dangers. According to individuals familiar with the process, Netflix's lawyers are not just evaluating future promises, they are measuring them against past representations. Any sudden reframing risks reinforcing the argument that earlier commitments were built on assumptions that no longer hold. At the same time, royal strategists are said to be executing parallel moves, not punitive, but preventative. Communications channels are reportedly tightening, informal briefings are being standardized. Palace staff are being reminded quietly of boundaries between historical context and commercial commentary. This is how institutions protect themselves, not with announcements, but with alignment. Sources suggest Prince William's team has been particularly firm. The future king is allegedly determined that the monarchy must not appear reactive. No public statements, no emotional cues, only steady distance. In institutional terms, distance is authority. King Charles III, insiders claim, has endorsed this approach. The crown cannot be seen negotiating with corporate disputes. Any signal of intervention could later be misinterpreted as influence or worse, liability. Meanwhile, Netflix is reportedly preparing for multiple outcomes, settlement pathways, arbitration scenarios, even the possibility of public disclosure if legal thresholds are crossed. Corporate risk management, sources note, is about optionality, being ready before necessity arrives. And beneath all of this strategy lies a more immediate concern: resources. Because countermoves cost money, legal teams bill by the hour. Development teams require funding. Security obligations do not pause for disputes. And as insiders now suggest, the Sussex's financial flexibility may not be as vast as the original headlines implied, which brings the story to its next pressure point. Because when strategy meets shrinking margins, power shifts quickly. And the next phase of this conflict is no longer about reputation, it is about endurance. Sources familiar with the Sussex's financial structure now suggest the dispute is exerting pressure in places far removed from courtrooms and palaces. This is the phase, insiders say, where high-profile agreements stop feeling abstract and start impacting day-to-day sustainability. The reported $100 million Netflix figure was never a single payout. According to individuals briefed on the deal, it was milestone-based, staggered across development phases, production deliverables, and performance triggers. If portions of that pipeline are now frozen or at risk of clawback, the immediate effect is liquidity, not optics. Insiders claim ongoing costs remain substantial. Montecito properties do not maintain themselves. Security requirements, once subsidized by royal infrastructure, now fall squarely on private accounts. Professional teams, legal, creative, public relations must be retained regardless of output. These are fixed obligations in a world of suddenly variable income. Sources also suggest secondary revenue streams are under review: speaking engagements, publishing schedules, brand partnerships. Each carries reputational sensitivity when a major corporate dispute is unfolding. Companies watching Netflix's moves may hesitate, waiting to see whether the platform enforces its claims or negotiates its exit. This hesitation compounds isolation. According to individuals close to the situation, financial advisors are now modeling worst-case scenarios. Prolonged arbitration, reduced future deals, increased legal exposure. None are catastrophic in isolation, but together they narrow options. What adds to the strain, sources say, is the psychological weight of inversion. Prince Harry, once buffered by institutional certainty, now operates within market discipline. Performance must be proven, risk must be priced. There is no ceremonial insulation from financial consequence. Across the Atlantic, royal accountants are not involved, but palace observers understand the symbolism. The Sussexes' independence was framed as freedom. Financial pressure reframes it as vulnerability, and as resources tighten, the human cost becomes harder to ignore. Sources describe a growing sense of encirclement, every decision scrutinized, every delay amplified, every option constrained by optics and law. This is the stage where disputes stop being strategic exercises and become personal sieges, because when money restricts movement, time becomes the most dangerous enemy of all. And time, as insiders warn, is no longer on their side. Sources close to the unfolding situation now describe a phase that legal filings rarely capture, but insiders understand well: the psychological siege that follows prolonged uncertainty. This is the moment when strategy and stamina begin to collide, when pressure seeps beyond advisors and into the private core of decision-making. According to individuals familiar with the Sussexes' inner circle, the atmosphere has reportedly grown more insular. Trusted contacts narrowed, communications filtered, each external interaction now weighed for legal implication and reputational risk. What once felt like autonomy has, insiders suggest, begun to resemble confinement. Prince Harry, sources say, is particularly affected by the convergence of forces, a lifetime shaped by institution, then rejection of it, now followed by confrontation with corporate systems equally unforgiving. There is no ceremonial language here, only contracts, compliance, and consequence. For someone raised within tradition and protection, the adjustment is said to be profound. Meghan Markle, according to those briefed on internal dynamics, remains outwardly composed but strategically vigilant. Every narrative thread is assessed for exposure, every public appearance scrutinized for unintended signaling. In high-stakes disputes, silence can be misread, but speech can be weaponized. Insiders claim the weight of being constantly interpreted by lawyers, executives, commentators, and royal observers has intensified the sense of siege. There is no neutral audience anymore. Every observer is a potential stakeholder. This psychological pressure is compounded by uncertainty over outcome. Will Netflix escalate? Will settlement discussions harden? Will private arbitration become public spectacle? The inability to predict direction drains energy and erodes confidence, sources say. Across the Atlantic, palace officials are reportedly aware of the strain but unmoved by it. Institutions do not respond to emotion, they respond to precedent. Sympathy, insiders caution, cannot override structural discipline. And this is where the narrative sharpens, because prolonged siege produces two possible responses: capitulation or defiance, compromise or confrontation. Each carries cost. Sources now suggest the Sussexes are approaching a moment of moral calculation, whether to fight for validation or pivot toward closure, whether to protect image or preserve resources, whether to speak or remain silent. And as that decision looms, one final force enters the equation: public judgment. Because once private pressure reaches critical mass, resolution demands a reckoning beyond contracts. It demands an audience. As sources suggest, the final chapter of this unfolding drama is not written in contracts or boardrooms, but in the court of perception, where morality, legacy, and institutional authority collide. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the stakes extend beyond missed deadlines or financial clawbacks. They now confront questions about responsibility, trust, and the limits of influence once wielded under the banner of royalty. Insiders indicate that Netflix's legal positioning, combined with the Sussexes' constrained resources and heightened scrutiny, has created a scenario in which moral judgment is inseparable from operational consequence. Every promise made, every commitment implied, and every strategic decision undertaken is now subject to layered analysis. from corporate counsel in Silicon Valley to palace advisors in London. The narrative, sources say, is no longer about what was intended, but what can be verified, enforced, and interpreted publicly. For the monarchy, the implications are both symbolic and institutional. King Charles III and Prince William reportedly observed the situation with the dual lenses of familial concern and constitutional stewardship. Royal sources allegedly stress that while personal missteps are human, public perception of accountability defines the integrity of the institution. Silence, discretion, and adherence to precedent are the tools of mitigation. Visible intervention could amplify risk rather than reduce it. And for the Sussexes, the reckoning is profoundly personal. Legal documents, media narratives, and financial pressures converge to test endurance, judgment, and cohesion. The moral calculus is unavoidable, whether to negotiate quietly, assert independence, or risk prolonged exposure for the sake of principle. Sources stress that this is a cautionary tale for anyone navigating intersections of personal brand, institutional privilege, and commercial enterprise, authority without accountability, influence without structure, and reputation without verification are vulnerabilities that even royalty cannot fully insulate. For the audience, insiders say the lesson is clear: observe carefully, question boldly, and recognize that high-profile disputes reveal as much about institutions as they do about individuals. As this saga continues to evolve, viewers are urged to stay attentive, watch how timelines, contracts, and choices intersect, analyze the pressures, and predict possible outcomes. Engage with the story critically, because in cases where prestige meets obligation, every decision has consequences that ripple far beyond the private sphere. The drama is not over. The verdict is still forming, and in every legal, institutional, and familial measure, the question remains: who will endure and who will be defined by failure?